The Anti-Defamation League proudly presents its Champion of Freedom Award to Dmitry Balyasny.
Wow, that's a tough one to follow. Thank you guys so much. Oh, this is heavy. I'm gonna put it over here. It's been a while since I won anything. I think in maybe third grade, so it takes a little getting used to. But to start off on a lighter note, just anybody who has one of the new Samsung Note phones, just please turn those off. They sometimes explode. Don't want any of that. And just a short moment of silence for Brad Jelena. I know everybody's torn up over this. I have kind of a variant take on this whole situation. I know everybody that you talk to is very upset because, you know, what kind of the common thinking is, where's the hope for the rest of us if these two can't make it work? But I kind of think about it differently. I think, like, you know, what the heck are they going to do? Who are they going to find to date that's better looking than the other person? Like, it's a tough act to follow. So to start off, before I talk about my story a little bit, I just want to take a moment, just thank everybody for making this dinner such a great success. First of all, the ADL team led by Lonnie and Lauren and all the staff just did a tremendous job. It takes a lot of work to make this come together. My co-chairs, my partners, benefactors, everybody that helped out, making a zillion calls while simultaneously obviously running their own firms and jobs. It takes a lot of work, and I really appreciate it. And of course, to my lovely wife, Rebecca, who worked tirelessly on this dinner, thank you so much. And to everybody, it's a great job on this. So I was asked to say a few words about ADL and to tell my story. I didn't really know much about ADL when David Richter kindly introduced the organization to me, and I did some research and found that it was a really fascinating and well-run organization that's managed to make an impact for over 100 years on a number of different issues. And for me, it actually is a lot of the values that it stands for kind of mesh with some aspects of, I think, what's helped make our firm a little bit successful. So I want to talk about that. But to start, as you've heard, ADL is dedicated to fighting hate basically in all its forms, as a simple explanation. They fight against the defamation of Jews. They fight against discrimination of all types, from gay and lesbian to ethnic minorities to religious discrimination, and against bullying on campuses around the country. They're fervent supporters of individual rights, freedoms, and as you heard, they actively help immigrants. To start with, just on my story, as hard as it is, today for my kids, hearing kind of about the old days of when we immigrated, I don't probably seem like an immigrant, especially when they hear me doing M&M impersonations. But at one point, I was a scrawny kid with a Russian accent, and just kind of trying to get along. I've been discriminated for being Jewish in Russia. I've been discriminated against for being Russian in the US. And of course today, on a much lighter, less discriminatory note, but we get lots of negative sentiment against hedge fund managers. So, we made too much money, then we made too little money, then we lost money. So we can't win, so we're going back to making money. When I was a 5-year-old, living in a apartment complex in Kiev, and when I say apartment complex, my kids would tell you it was more like the projects when we visited. My daughter Sky, who's here tonight, when we pulled up to it a few years ago to show them where I grew up, she said, "We're getting out of the car here." So anyway, I like to play soccer on the playground downstairs. And one day I was 5 years old. I went downstairs to play soccer, and one of the kids told me I couldn't play because I was a Jew. And I had no idea what the heck he was talking about. So I went upstairs and I asked my parents, what does that mean? Why why couldn't I play soccer? And so my parents did their best to explain that being Jewish was something to be proud of, that a lot of the most successful and brilliant people in the world came from a Jewish background, from this very small minority group. And the kids were just ignorant, or maybe they were imitating their uneducated parents. But to me, I was 5 years old and I couldn't play soccer. So I didn't yet know about, much more important situations, like a good friend of my parents, who I heard about later, being denied a valedictorian gold medal in their school given to the top student at the school, which gives you tremendous options for going to the best university and career options. And she didn't get it because she was Jewish, although she was unquestionably the top student. All I knew was I couldn't play soccer. So, this small episode was one of the things that I think contributed to my parents considering immigrating at the time, and possibly robbed the world of the next great soccer player. A year later, I was having a conversation with my dad, and for those who don't know me very well, I'm a fervent believer in capitalism and freedom. I'm a big fan of Atlas Shrugged. I'm an entrepreneur. But just to give you a sense of how communist propaganda can infect the mind, even at a young age, my dad was telling me about a friend of his who had the rare opportunity to travel overseas, which didn't happen very often in Russia in those days. And my 6-year-old self replied, he can travel the entire world, but he's always going to come back to the motherland. If you can picture me saying that. And shortly after that, my parents decided to immigrate, for which I will forever be grateful. My parents' heroic decision to immigrate was not unusual. People come every day to the U.S. from Russia, from Africa, from Syria, seeking better lives for themselves and usually, more importantly, for their children. But just because it's not unusual doesn't make it any less heroic. We're used to it. We're often blasé about it. And we tend to myopically focus on the few negatives, and we don't often reflect on the challenges that are involved. For me growing up, I knew a lot of kids who immigrated, and I just thought it was a normal thing. But, imagine for a second, if tomorrow you had to immigrate to China, and you had zero money, no connections, no ability to speak language, all right? My parents moved from a place where you had to stand in line for hours to buy a bottle of milk, where the only way to get anything done was via bribing somebody or some sort of political pandering. But moving here presented its own challenges. Once you filed for permission to immigrate, you lost your job, you couldn't work. And there was an extended period between when you filed for permission and when you got permission. And once you actually got permission, you couldn't take any valuables with you. So you had no property that you could take. A number of our friends tried to figure out ways around this by swallowing diamonds, cutting out paintings and sewing them into briefcases, like spies trying to make, making a game out of it. But we didn't have any diamonds, we didn't have any paintings. So we were spared the ordeal of swallowing diamonds, but we started with nothing. In a amazing coincidence, full circle of life type of story, Rebecca's parents, Wally and Wendy, who I would meet 30 years later, took very significant personal risks going to Russia several years after we immigrated to help Jewish people immigrate to Israel and the US. And the ADL also happened to play a very significant role in giving Soviet Jews a voice and ultimately in helping to open the gates of immigration from Russia. While leaving behind the discrimination of being Jewish in Russia, I walked into being discriminated against in the US for not being able to speak English and for being from Russia during the Cold War. For those who don't remember those days or are too young, watch a great TV show called The Americans. It's a great show. And while we were not spies like the characters on the show, although I was accused multiple times in school of being a spy. You could very quickly see that people from Russia in the early 80s were not very popular here. You're bullied for being different, not knowing how to dress, speaking with an accent, etc. And I'm always telling my kids when they see a strangely dressed kid in their class who says things in English in weird ways, that could have been me. To give you a sense of our economic situation at the time, my dad would literally find a couch that somebody threw out in an alley, and we'd bring it back home with the same excitement we have today when we find one at the mart. Although there is a benefit, our delivery times from the alley were about 5 minutes, versus if anybody's ordered something from the mart, it's about 5 years. We found TVs, chairs, tables. One of their first trips to the supermarket, my parents bought canned dog food. We didn't have a dog. They thought a dog was on the picture of the ad because it was cool advertising. They never even considered that people would buy special food for their pets. My mom and dad, who had graduate degrees and worked as an engineer and a college professor in Kiev, wound up cleaning roadside motel rooms for $3 an hour until they learned to speak English. And as incredible as it sounds, it's a pretty typical immigrant story, and there's many that are much worse. Thankfully, America was then and remains today a land of opportunity for anyone with the drive and the tenacity to build a better life. And it was really just reminded me again this weekend when I was on a flight from taking my daughter to college. I was reading through an Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing companies. And it's just amazing how many of them are started by recent immigrants that had very similar stories, much worse in some cases, that immigrated in some cases by themselves with no money, no connections, no family, and are responsible for building some of the fastest growing businesses, employing thousands and thousands of people around the country, and really driving the economic growth of this country. Like many before them, my parents worked multiple jobs, learned English, persevered to get back to their careers, saved money. Eventually, we made it out of Rogers Park to the burbs, where I would say I had a typical middle-class upbringing, going to good schools, and working a variety of jobs. I started in sales because I figured that was the only way I could avoid minimum wage, because you get paid a commission. That was a pretty good observation for a 12-year-old. I sold radio ads over the phone. I sold squeegees and brooms door to door. At one point, I filled my parents' basement to overflowing with home alarms that I was going to distribute, except I never sold any of those. They just made horrible noises. I had a business selling CDs and stereos at one point in high school, where I would take stereos and CDs to people's homes. And at one point, I was pulled over with a car full of stereo equipment next to the Joliet Penitentiary. And when I told the police officer that I was working, he said, "No, you ain't. You're playing Russian roulette." And eventually, by the time I started college, I was selling investments as a stockbroker. I was not an instant success. I very consistently lost all the money I made as a broker, trading for my own account, and more. And as Taylor said, I was lucky enough to answer an ad in the paper when Schoenfeld was opening an office, after sending my resume to about 50 different funds who did not reply. So I started trading. I took a little while to get going, and then got a little bit consistent and started building out a team, a number of whom are still here with us tonight, working with me for over 20 years. As our little team grew, we grew from a little group to a division, and then eventually a firm. We found that we were competing with other funds that were run by guys who were much smarter than me, much wealthier than me, much better capitalized and more experienced than we were. But we figured out that we could build an advantage through the culture, focusing on people and focusing on development of people, that was differentiated from our peers. In the early days, we would interview people from much larger firms, and we would hear all sorts of horror stories about random firings, random capital cuts, having to put coins into a vending machine to get a Coke at work, worse, having soda bottles thrown at people's heads for bad trading ideas by angry portfolio managers, getting screamed and berated for trades that didn't work. And in contrast, while we couldn't offer them more capital or better economics, we would talk about offsites to Lake Tahoe or Jackson Hole for our team. We would talk about, recently we had 35 people do the Chicago Triathlon together from work. We'd show pictures of Bring Your Kids to Work Day, which if your firm hasn't done this, you absolutely should. It is fantastically funny and great experience for the kids and everybody involved. And we would talk about how, when there's bad trades or drawdowns, that would lead to a collaborative research process to figure out what was wrong and collaborative discussion to how to improve it, as opposed to berating people. And so a lot of these principles and values are very similar to what ADL stands for. Treating people with respect, collaboratively working to understand each other. That's one of the things that really led to the success that we've been able to enjoy. Occasionally, we had to fire portfolio managers who turned out to be abusive to their colleagues, even when they were profitable. We try not to tolerate bullying behavior of junior employees that other firms might overlook. Even during interviewing, for those of you starting out in your careers, like a surefire way of not getting a job is being rude to a receptionist, right? I can't tell you how many people we've passed on over the years when the receptionist said that they were kind of a jerk. So being respectful, making decisions on the basis of long-term self-interest to mutual advantage really became a business strategy. And so gradually, a small group has grown to a 500-person firm that's delivered strong results over a number of years to our clients, and I feel like we're just getting warmed up. What would happen if every company treated people this way? Hopefully not every hedge fund, because I want to have an advantage. And what if more people took ADL's no-hate principles to heart? Could we prevent bullying in our schools, like the recent case of Milan Chatterjee? It's a student who had to leave UCLA Law School after being mercilessly harassed by his fellow students for voicing his opinion against an anti-Israel campaign on campus at the UCLA Law School, and he was Indian, right? And he was harassed so much he wound up transferring to a different school. And unfortunately, discrimination is not something that we just read about in dusty textbooks that used to happen, in concentration camps of World War II or in the civil rights movement. You could see it every day. Just in recent examples, if you've watched Straight Outta Compton, another great movie, the way the police treated the musicians, just terrible. Or on the flip side, the recent sniper shootings of police officers, just horrible things. Could we prevent the next crime against a gay couple who wants to hold hands in public? Or against an African-American kid who just wants to get an equal education without bullying, which the ADL championed as far back as Brown versus the Board of Education. Maybe we can even prevent a terrorist attack like we saw in New York this last week, or at the very least, help a Jewish kid play soccer. With your support, the ADL team is working tirelessly to help create a world without hate, where these kind of things are possible. Across campuses, with law enforcement, they persevere to eradicate discrimination and promote freedom. Please support this outstanding organization so they can continue this important work. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you again for this award. Special thank you to my parents for everything you've always done for me and bringing me to this great country. To my wife, Rebecca, the ADL team, my colleagues at BAM, and all my friends and family here and away, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Love all of you.